Hello, and welcome to a quick overview of the American judicial system. So, I'm going to give you a really concise, fast explanation as to how the judicial system works today. And then in a later lecture, I'm going to start to break down some of these parts in a little bit bigger chunks so that you can kind of understand them. But here's the macro view. Okay, so I'm going to put the cards on the table. The Supreme Court section of Article 3, which deals with the courts, is one paragraph. And all it says about the Supreme Court is that there shall be a Supreme Court. That's it. It doesn't explain what that Supreme Court's supposed to do. There are currently 9 members of the Supreme Court, and there have been for decades. But that number is not specified. And we have had other numbers of Supreme Court justices in our past. You have to remember that. But the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. It is effectively what we call the last court of appeal. If you lose all the way up the process, when you get to the Supreme Court, it's over. So essentially, I want you to imagine our court structure like a pyramid. At the tip top of the pyramid is the Supreme Court. Below the Supreme Court, we have what are called federal courts of appeals. I'll talk about them more in a later lecture. But the federal courts of appeals are based on groupings of states. So several states, and sometimes it's parts of states. So states divided in half. Half of the state might be in one judicial district and another in another judicial district. And so if you lose at the district court level, then you can appeal to the appellate court, which is based in a couple of different areas. And again, we'll talk about that more. And if you lose again, well, then you can appeal to the Supreme Court. But that's your last kick at the can. Now, the base of our pyramid are federal district courts. You need to remember this is distinct from the state court structure, which again, I'll talk about later on, but I'm not talking about that right now. Just the federal system. So in the federal system, you only have what are called district courts. And in those district courts, they can only hear issues that are federal. Let me give you an example. If you have an individual from one state, say Kentucky, suing an individual from another state, say New York, that state can go into a federal district court because of a topic known as jurisdiction. We'll go into that later on in another lecture. You can also hear issues and cases that are based on federal law. There's a couple of key examples of this, but the best one by far is bankruptcy. If you want to declare bankruptcy, you will be in the federal system, period. There's no such thing as a state bankruptcy court. We call that subject matter jurisdiction because the subject of the case is federal, ergo, it must be in federal court. A lot of those things I'll go back to, but I want you to remember that pyramid, all right? Base of the pyramid is district courts. On top of it are courts of appeal. And at the very tip top is the Supreme Court, which has 9 members. Now, what are the powers and responsibilities of the Supreme Court? According to the Constitution, nothing. Nothing other than being the last court of appeal, the highest court in the land. But why are we arguing constantly about the Supreme Court? Well, that has to do with a concept that's called judicial review. And when I do the lecture on Marbury versus Madison, I'll get more into that. But understand that under judicial review, which is a concept, it's not a law, it's not written down anywhere other than in a Supreme Court case. The idea is that it is the Supreme Court's power and its responsibility to determine if laws passed by Congress or by the various states conflict with the Constitution. And remember, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So if a law violates the Constitution, then the Constitution wins. End of story. Now, how do you get to be a federal court judge? It actually doesn't matter because the process is the same. The process is the same whether we're talking about a district court judge, a judge that sits on the Court of Appeals, or a judge that sits on the United States Supreme Court. The process is identical. The president nominates an individual. That individual then goes before the Senate and needs to be confirmed by a simple majority. You only need 51 votes in the Senate to confirm a judicial appointee. That is the same, whether it's one of the 9 Supreme Court justices or one of the many, many, many district court justices. And critically, here's another similarity: there's no qualifications. You don't actually have to be a lawyer, you don't have to have graduated law school. Now, to be fair, every single member of the Supreme Court to date has always had a law degree, but technically you don't have to. There's no age limit. If you're watching this and you're 16 years old, 17 years old, you are eligible for the United States Supreme Court, sitting there right now. And justices serve until life, retirement, or impeachment. No Supreme Court justice has ever been impeached. It crops up from time to time with district court judges, but it's very rare. Most serve for life. Why? Well, the idea being that we want judges to make impartial decisions based on the law, not based on the wills of the political electorate, which might change. And we want judges to be able to protect minority rights, even though those rights might not be overwhelmingly popular at the time. That's the rationale. Now, arguments against. Well, there's a couple arguments against, but I think the most important of which is that you could have someone who's not elected because the electorate, the voters, they don't choose Supreme Court justices. They don't choose district court justices. So you could have an unelected official who serves for decades who you don't agree with. That's the counter to that. So it's two sides of a coin here. And I'm not going to weigh in on whether I think it's right or wrong. I think that there's positives and negatives on both. Now, of course, like our other branches, the judicial branch plays a very important role in our checks and balances. The Supreme Court has as its base duty the idea that it must interpret the laws and decide if they are constitutional. Now, they don't get to do whatever they want, though, because they're appointed by the executive branch and confirmed by the Senate. So, to get to that process, there's a series of checks in order to make sure that the Supreme Court doesn't have unparalleled power. And remember, even though it's not been used, there is the possibility of impeaching a Supreme Court justice. As I mentioned before, I'll go into many of these issues in greater detail later on, but for right now, understand that is the basic overview of the American judicial system.